What if the war you saw on the news was never the real war at all? What if the actual battle wasn't fought with missiles, but with a quiet plan to break a nation apart from the inside, a plan that just failed? Before we go further, if you want the kind of analysis that looks past headlines and into the actual strategy behind this conflict, hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who still thinks this war is only about bombs. Because what you're about to hear explains something most coverage completely missed. For decades, there's been a quiet assumption sitting underneath almost every Western strategy toward Iran. The assumption that Iran is fragile, that underneath its strong public image, the country is actually a patchwork of unhappy regions, frustrated minorities, and a population one economic crisis away from turning on its own government. That assumption isn't new. It goes back generations, all the way to how outside powers viewed Persia long before the modern Islamic Republic ever existed. Colonial-era planners studied this land the same way. Cold War strategists studied it the same way too. But over the last year, as tensions between Washington and Tehran reached a boiling point, that old assumption stopped being background theory. It became an actual operating plan. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. That plan didn't fail because of a lucky break. It failed because Iran understood exactly what was coming and prepared for it long before the first move was ever made. Let's rewind and understand why anyone in Washington would even believe a strategy like this could work in the first place. Iran is not a small, simple country. It's home to Persians, but also Kurds, Azeris, Baluchis, Arabs, and several other ethnic and religious communities spread across a vast and difficult landscape. From the mountains near Iraq to the deserts bordering Pakistan, from the Caspian coast in the north to the Persian Gulf in the south. On paper, that kind of diversity looks like a weakness to any outside power trying to break a country apart. History is full of examples where empires used exactly this kind of internal diversity as a lever, find the group with the most grievances, apply pressure there, and let internal tension do the work that a direct invasion never could. That's not a new idea. It's one of the oldest tools in geopolitics. Instead of attacking a country's army, you attack its unity. You look for the cracks that already exist, and you widen them patiently, quietly, sometimes over years, until the government inside that country is too busy managing internal chaos to project any strength outward at all. The British Empire used it across South Asia and the Middle East for over a century. The Soviet Union used it in its own border regions. Modern great powers have simply refined the same old idea with better tools: satellite broadcasting instead of pamphlets, social media instead of secret agents slipping across borders on foot. So when tensions between the United States and Iran escalated sharply, and after direct military confrontation raised the stakes higher than they'd been in decades, a second track of pressure appeared alongside the missiles and the diplomacy. Not a battlefield track, an internal one. This is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because understanding this internal track means understanding how modern pressure campaigns actually work. They rarely look like sabotage in an old spy movie. They look like economic squeeze designed to hit specific regions harder than others. They look like media narratives quietly amplified to stir resentment between different parts of a country's population. They look like targeted messaging aimed at communities who already feel like their concerns get less attention from the central government than they deserve. The logic behind a strategy like this is simple, and honestly, kind of chilling once you see it clearly. If you can convince enough people inside a country that their own government is the reason for their suffering, rather than the outside pressure actually causing it, you don't need to defeat that government militarily at all. You just need to wait for its own people to eventually do the work for you. It's a strategy built entirely on patience, on letting economic pain do the persuading instead of soldiers. Quick pause here, because I want you to actually think about this with me instead of just listening. Have you ever seen a country accused of being fragile from within and wondered whether that fragility was real or whether it was something being deliberately manufactured from the outside? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to know what you think, and it helps me understand what to dig into next in this series. Let's talk about what this pressure actually looked like in practice, because the details matter more than the theory. Economic sanctions on Iran have never been evenly felt across the entire country. Some regions, often the ones already furthest from the political center, tend to absorb the sharpest edges of that economic pain first. Fuel shortages hit harder in certain provinces. Currency collapse hits harder where people already have the thinnest financial cushion. When international pressure escalates, it rarely lands as a single uniform weight across an entire nation. It lands unevenly, and that unevenness is not always accidental. Border regions with weaker infrastructure and less local investment tend to feel every shock first and hardest long before the effects ever reach the capital. A currency crash in Tehran is an inconvenience. The same currency crash in a border province that already struggles with basic services can feel like an emergency. Alongside the economic pressure came something harder to measure, but arguably more dangerous: a sustained information effort aimed at specific communities inside Iran. messaging that emphasized historical grievances, messaging that painted the central government in Tehran as indifferent, or worse, hostile to certain regions and ethnic groups. None of this required tanks or soldiers. It required patience, funding, and platforms, exactly the kind of tools that modern information warfare specializes in. Social media accounts, satellite broadcasts, diaspora networks, all quietly amplifying a single underlying message. Your suffering is their fault, not the fault of the pressure being applied from outside. The strategic bet being made here was straightforward. Apply enough combined pressure, economic hardship, plus a steady drumbeat of division-focused messaging, and eventually some part of the country cracks. A protest turns into something bigger. A regional grievance turns into an uprising, and once that happens, the government in Tehran has to divide its attention and its resources between an external threat and an internal one at the exact same time. A government fighting on two fronts, one military and one political, is a government far more likely to eventually accept terms it would never accept while standing united. That, according to the read of many geopolitical analysts watching this conflict closely, was the real hope sitting behind a significant portion of the pressure campaign against Iran. Not necessarily a quick military knockout, a slower, quieter unraveling from within, time to eventually force concessions at the negotiating table that battlefield pressure alone hadn't managed to produce. So why didn't it work? This is the part of the story that deserves real attention because the answer says something important about how much the world actually understands about Iran's internal reality versus how much of that understanding is built on decades-old assumptions that never got properly updated. The first reason is something that gets consistently underestimated by outside observers: the strength of Iranian national identity itself. Iran has a civilizational history that stretches back thousands of years, long before the current government, long before the Islamic Republic, long before any of the modern political labels attached to it today. That deep historical identity doesn't disappear just because a government becomes unpopular in certain quarters. Many Iranians who have real serious criticisms of their own leadership still draw a hard line the moment outside pressure starts looking like an attempt to break their country apart from the outside. Criticism of your own government and support for a foreign power actively working to fracture your nation are two very different things, and conflating them was, according to many observers, one of the deeper miscalculations built into this entire strategy. That miscalculation isn't unique to this conflict either. It's a mistake outside powers have repeatedly made throughout modern history, assuming that internal political frustration automatically translates into support for outside intervention. It almost never does. People can be furious with their own leadership and still feel something close to fury toward anyone trying to use that frustration as a weapon against their homeland. That distinction gets lost again and again in strategic planning rooms far removed from the actual lived experience of the people those plans are meant to target. Planners sitting in offices thousands of miles away tend to see grievance as a lever. People actually living with that grievance usually experience it very differently once an outside power tries to pull that lever. The second reason ties directly into how Iran's own government responded once it recognized what was actually happening. Rather than treating this as a purely military problem to be solved with force alone, reports throughout this period suggest Tehran leaned heavily into a parallel strategy of its own, actively working to reinforce a sense of shared national stakes across its different regions and communities. That meant visible outreach to minority regions. It meant framing the conflict publicly, not as a fight between the government and its own people, but as a fight between the entire nation and outside interference. Whether or not you agree with the government doing the framing, the strategic logic behind it is hard to dismiss. If the goal from outside is division, the most direct countermeasure is deliberate, visible unity. This wasn't purely rhetorical either. Reports throughout the period point to targeted efforts to keep basic services functioning even in the hardest hit border regions, and to keep communication lines open with local and religious leaders in minority communities, and to avoid the kind of heavy-handed crackdowns that historically tend to backfire and actually validate the exact grievances an outside pressure campaign is trying to exploit. None of this means those regions had no legitimate complaints. It means the government appears to have understood that mishandling this moment could hand its adversaries exactly the internal crisis they were hoping for. The third reason is simpler but often gets overlooked entirely: timing. Division campaigns like this one typically take years to fully mature. They rely on slow, patient erosion of trust, not sudden shocks. But this conflict escalated fast, faster than most long-term internal pressure campaigns are built to keep pace with. A strategy designed to quietly widen cracks over 5 or 10 years doesn't necessarily transfer cleanly onto a conflict that reaches a full military confrontation within months. The timeline mismatch left the internal pressure campaign underdeveloped exactly when it needed to be at its strongest. Think about it this way. A slow-building internal fracture campaign is like water slowly wearing away stone. It works, but it needs time most conflicts don't actually give it. When the missiles started flying and the war moved at a pace measured in weeks rather than years, that patient erosion process simply didn't have the runway it needed to fully take hold before the diplomatic phase of this confrontation arrived. Years of careful groundwork got compressed into a window far too short to actually deliver the internal rupture the strategy depended on. If this kind of breakdown is helping you see this conflict differently than the surface-level coverage you've been getting elsewhere, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. This channel exists specifically to dig past the headline version of these stories, and there's a lot more still to unpack here. Now, let's talk about the negotiating table, because this is where the entire strategy was ultimately supposed to pay off. The theory behind combining military pressure with internal destabilization was never just about weakening Iran for its own sake. It was about producing leverage. The idea was that a country dealing with internal unrest alongside external military pressure would eventually walk into negotiations desperate, willing to accept terms it would have flatly rejected under normal circumstances. That's actually a very old pattern in how major powers have historically approached negotiations with smaller or mid-sized states. You don't just negotiate with the country you're facing. You try to shape the internal conditions that country is negotiating from, so that by the time both sides sit down at the table, one side is negotiating out of strength and the other is negotiating out of exhaustion. This is exactly the kind of dynamic diplomats and strategists study in every major negotiation throughout history, from post-war settlements to modern trade disputes. The party under the most internal strain almost always concedes more. But here's what actually happened when talks did move forward. Iran did not arrive at the table as a country falling apart internally. It arrived as a country that had, by most independent assessments, held together far more cohesively than the pressure campaign had counted on. And that single fact changed the entire dynamic of what concessions were realistically achievable. When a country negotiates from a position of internal fragility, its leadership has strong incentives to accept almost anything just to make the immediate pain stop. But when a country negotiates from a position of relative internal stability, even while under serious external pressure, its leadership has far more room to hold firm on core positions, because the assumed alternative, internal collapse, simply isn't the reality on the ground anymore. This is genuinely important to understand because it reframes how we should think about the eventual agreements and understandings that did emerge from this period of intense confrontation. Rather than being the product of Iran being cornered and desperate, many analysts argue those outcomes were shaped by a far more balanced negotiating position than the original strategy had assumed would exist by that point. The negotiators sitting across the table from Iran's representatives weren't dealing with a government begging for relief. They were dealing with a government that had already survived the exact scenario meant to force its hand. Let's talk about why this matters far beyond just this one conflict, because the implications here are bigger than a single round of negotiations between two countries. If a strategy built around internal division and economic pressure fails to produce the desperation it was designed to produce, that's not just a tactical setback for whoever built that strategy. It's a signal to every other country watching from the sidelines, a signal that this particular playbook, sanctions plus internal destabilization plus military pressure, has a real demonstrated limit to how effective it can actually be against a country with strong enough internal cohesion. And that's a lesson with consequences reaching far beyond the Middle East. Every government currently under some form of sustained external pressure, whether economic, military, or informational, is watching how this particular confrontation played out. And what they're taking away from it, rightly or wrongly, is that internal unity itself can function as a genuine strategic asset, one capable of blunting even a sophisticated, well-funded pressure campaign built around fracturing a nation from within. Here's a quick thought experiment worth sitting with before we go further. Imagine two identical countries facing the exact same external pressure, same sanctions, same military threats, same information campaigns. The only difference between them is how united their population feels heading into that pressure. Which one ends up making bigger concessions at the negotiating table? The answer seems obvious once you frame it that way, and yet outside strategy has repeatedly underestimated exactly how much that single variable, internal unity, actually matters compared to raw military or economic power alone. Let's slow down here for a second, because I think there's a deeper point worth sitting with. This entire strategy, at its core, was a bet on human nature. A bet that when people are squeezed hard enough economically and told often enough that their own government is the source of their suffering rather than outside pressure, they will eventually turn inward against each other rather than outward against whoever is actually applying the pressure. That's a cynical bet, but it's not an irrational one. It has worked in other contexts, in other conflicts, in other moments throughout history. Empires have used exactly this approach successfully before, and entire nations have fractured along exactly these kinds of engineered fault lines. What makes this particular case worth studying closely is that the bet didn't pay off, at least not to the degree the strategy required. And understanding why gives us a genuinely useful window into what actually holds a nation together under this kind of stress versus what modern strategists sometimes assume, often incorrectly, will tear it apart. There's also a broader geopolitical current running underneath all of this worth naming directly. This confrontation didn't happen in isolation. It unfolded during a period where the broader global order itself has been visibly shifting, with countries like Russia and China taking a more active interest in how conflicts like this one resolve, and with a growing number of nations globally showing less automatic deference to pressure campaigns led by any single dominant power. That backdrop matters, because a strategy built around isolating and internally fracturing a target country works very differently in a world where that country has meaningful economic and diplomatic relationships elsewhere than it does in a world where that country stands completely alone. Iran, whatever your view of its government, did not enter this confrontation completely isolated on the world stage. That reality alone changes the strategic math considerably compared to earlier decades, when a pressure campaign like this might have faced far less resistance and far fewer alternative economic lifelines for the country on the receiving end. Trade relationships, energy partnerships, and diplomatic backing from major powers outside the Western sphere all gave Tehran options that simply didn't exist in earlier eras of sanctions pressure. A country with somewhere else to sell its oil, somewhere else to borrow money, and somewhere else to find diplomatic cover is a much harder country to squeeze into desperation than one standing completely alone against the world. Now, it's worth being honest and balanced here, because analysis like this can tip too easily into simplistic hero and villain framing, and that's not what serious analysis should ever look like. Iran's government has real internal critics, real unresolved grievances among some of its regional and ethnic communities, and real economic struggles that predate this conflict entirely and have nothing to do with any outside plan. None of that disappears just because an external destabilization strategy ultimately fell short of its goals. A country successfully resisting outside attempts to fracture it is not automatically the same thing as a country with no internal problems worth addressing on its own terms. Holding both of those realities at once, acknowledging genuine internal challenges while also recognizing a genuine external campaign designed to exploit them, is exactly the kind of nuanced view that gets lost in most coverage of conflicts like this one. Most coverage wants a clean story. Good guys, bad guys, winners, losers. The actual picture here is far messier and far more interesting than that. A government can survive an external fracture campaign and still owe its own people real reforms. Those two facts are not in conflict with each other, no matter how often coverage tries to force them into a single simple narrative. Before we move into the final part of this analysis, here's something worth doing right now instead of later. If you've stayed with me this far, you clearly want the deeper picture, not the shallow version. So take 30 seconds, tap that subscribe button, and turn on notifications. This channel is going to keep tracking how this story develops, and I don't want you finding out the next chapter through some random clip weeks after the fact. Let's talk about what comes next, because this story doesn't simply end with one failed strategy. Strategic thinking on the side that built this pressure campaign doesn't just disappear because one attempt didn't fully succeed. It adapts. It's entirely plausible, according to many analysts following this closely, that lessons learned from this specific campaign get folded into future approaches. Sharper targeting of specific regional grievances, more sophisticated information campaigns, different timing that better matches the actual pace required for this kind of internal pressure to mature properly. Which means the real story here isn't necessarily that this particular strategy is permanently dead, it's that this particular version of it, executed under this particular timeline, against this particular country, ran into a wall of unity that its architects underestimated. That's a meaningful outcome, but it's not necessarily a permanent one. The underlying logic behind division-based pressure campaigns isn't going anywhere. It's simply going to keep evolving, the same way every strategic approach in history eventually evolves after an early version of it meets unexpected resistance. For Iran specifically, surviving this phase of pressure doesn't mean the underlying challenges disappear either. Sanctions pressure, economic strain, and genuine internal political debates about the country's direction all continue, regardless of how this particular confrontation played out diplomatically. What changed isn't that Iran is now free of pressure. What changed is that one specific tool inside that broader pressure campaign, the attempt to fracture the country internally as a path toward forced concessions, didn't produce the outcome its architects were counting on. And that distinction actually matters enormously for how we should think about what happens from here. This isn't a story with a clean, permanent ending. It's a story about one round of a much longer contest, where a specific strategic bet didn't pay off the way it was designed to, and where both sides are now recalibrating based on what that outcome revealed about the other's actual internal strength. There's one more layer worth adding before we wrap up, because it's easy to miss if you're only following the diplomatic headlines. Every time a major pressure campaign like this one plays out publicly, it becomes a case study, studied quietly in policy circles, in military academies, in think tanks around the world, long after the news cameras move on to the next story. The specific lessons drawn from this confrontation: why the internal fracture strategy underperformed, which countermeasures actually worked, how quickly a population can be rallied around shared national identity even under serious economic strain, all of that becomes raw material for the next version of this same contest. Wherever and whenever it happens again, nothing here fully ends. It just shifts into the next phase of planning. It's also worth thinking about this from the perspective of ordinary people living through it, on every side of this story. For families inside Iran, especially in the regions that absorb the heaviest economic pressure, this wasn't an abstract strategic contest playing out in think tanks. It was fuel lines, rising prices, and daily uncertainty about whether the situation would get worse before it got better. Whatever the strategic outcome, that lived hardship was real, and it didn't disappear just because the broader fracture strategy failed to achieve its ultimate political goal. Understanding the geopolitics here doesn't mean losing sight of the fact that real people carried the actual weight of this pressure campaign, regardless of how the chess pieces moved above their heads. So here's where I want to leave you with this. What we've walked through today isn't really a story about Iran alone. It's a story about the limits of a strategy that assumes any country with internal diversity is automatically fragile, automatically ready to fracture under enough combined pressure. That assumption has driven major power strategy for a very long time, and this confrontation offered a real, live test of whether it still holds up in the world as it actually exists today, not the world as it existed decades ago when that assumption was first built into policy thinking. The answer this specific case gave us was more complicated than a simple yes or no. Internal unity, it turns out, can be a genuine strategic asset, one capable of absorbing and blunting pressure that was specifically designed to exploit division. But that same unity doesn't erase the real internal challenges any country carries, challenges that exist independently of whatever outside pressure happens to be applied at any given moment. What makes this story genuinely worth remembering isn't the specific outcome of one round of negotiations or the specific details of one pressure campaign. It's the broader lesson sitting underneath all of it, that the oldest strategy in the geopolitical playbook, break them from within so they'll bend from without, still depends entirely on something no outside power can fully manufacture or control, whether the people inside that country actually choose unity when it matters most. That's the real question, worth carrying forward from everything we've covered today. Not whether this specific plan worked this specific time, but whether any outside power can ever reliably predict in advance which nations will hold together under this kind of pressure and which ones will actually break. History suggests that's a far harder question to answer than most strategists ever want to admit. And this confrontation just added one more data point to a puzzle that's been unfolding for centuries, one that will keep unfolding long after this particular round of tension fades from the headlines. What do you think? Do you believe internal unity can consistently hold up against this kind of sustained external pressure, or do you think what we saw here was closer to an exception than a rule? Tell me your honest take in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know where you actually stand on this. If this analysis gave you a clearer picture of what's really happening beneath the surface of this conflict, that's exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe, share this with someone who needs to see past the headlines on this story, and I'll see you in the next one.